Hello everyone. So this is just going to be a video in which I document some of my personal art process. You'll see a little bit of me going through art historical textbooks, historical books on the Northern Renaissance, things like that, and you will also see some footage of me working in my current scrapbook, sketchbook / grimoire. A note about that is that I'm working on like an overarching project idea that I'm kind of hoping to turn into an ongoing like developing skill set or set of themes. It's a bit awkward in some ways because I think you'll be able to tell that the model for the thing that I'm drawing today specifically is my own face. But I wanted to pursue that in a very particular sort of stretched out and strange angle. And obviously when you have that specific of an idea in mind, reference photos and things online can be a little bit hard to come by, especially that are available for common usage. So occasionally I'll just take the camera to my face and do all sorts of weird things in order to kind of get some of the angles and ideas I'm looking for. So there is that. I'm also sort of experimenting with new materials and a mix of different types of media. As you'll see at some point, the gold paint that I use literally came in the post while I was in the process of working on the drawing itself. So that's my first time using it. So it's interesting. Definitely worth further exploration. I am told that this kind of paint, once dry, can also be burnished. So we'll see what that looks like. But yeah, just a bunch of different things. Within the video, I also take the opportunity to talk a bit about Yoav Ben-Dov's open reading technique, more specifically his Tarot, the Open Reading book, which I have a copy of, and sort of discussing even more specifically than that, his approach to explaining tarot history and what the historical impetus and motivation behind the images are, and then inferring things about what the images mean from that. I love his technique and his reading method that he kind of propagated. I'm not at all crazy about the way he explains his history, but I get into that sort of in a voiceover and so on as I'm showing you footage, and I will be sort of intersplicing throughout the video, I think, images, like as and when I reference something or whatever, I'll make sure to include visual content that kind of anchors what I'm saying in some kind of visual material. It is entirely possible, I actually haven't watched back my own footage yet, but it's entirely possible that my tone will get quite agitated and ranty, as I am so wont to do when I get excited about things. I've actually attempted to film my critique specifically of his chapter or segment in his book on his tarot history. I've tried to film that multiple times already at different points in the last few months, and each time I'm like, oh, I can't regulate my tone. So I think I maybe did a slightly better job this time, but at any rate we'll see, and hopefully this will both communicate something useful, interesting, if not either of those things, that maybe at the very least entertaining, as well as showing some of my own sort of art process and ways I cobble ideas together and then start sketching them out and playing with technique or playing with medium and, to be honest, just making a mess. So on that note, I'm going to go clean up now, and you guys, presumably, if you're interested, can continue to watch this video. I hope you enjoy. The first thing I do want to mention, especially as relates to tarot and tarot imagery and the ways in which art historical information has always been an intrinsic part of that process, is I want to start by offering a critique of a certain section of Yoav Ben-Dov's Tarot, the Open Reading, which obviously focuses largely on reading the Marseille-style cards. The technique that he employs in his book himself, more generally, is something that I find really useful, and I think the book is a good standalone in that regard, but and I'll talk about it some other time and how that relates to reading Renaissance paintings and other such forms of art historical works, because that's a technique that does apply to looking at and reading imagery. But for now, I want to talk about the way in which he discusses the historical backdrop for that material, and offer some critique of what he says here, because I honestly think that for the most part, the historical section, the sort of introductory historical section about the tarot in this book is, well, certainly devoid of citations for one thing, but for another, just deeply incorrect in a lot of areas. So, you know, to be taken with a grain of salt, if to be taken with validity, any form of validity at all. For historical material, there's a reason citations are important. So when discussing why the people of Renaissance Italy would have done more than just adopting the quote-unquote Oriental card game, as he calls it, why would they add and make everything more complicated by using the 22 cards of the major arcana and so on, he then continues as follows. The question seems even more puzzling when we consider the imagery of the major suit cards. 2 cards bear images of the emperor and the pope. These were traditional figures of political and religious authority at that time. But other cards present strange themes and figures such as a woman pope, a bisexual devil, a skeleton with a scythe, demons and angels, and a host of naked figures. All these appear to be on the same level as the figures of authority and social order. One card, called the Wheel of Fortune, even shows an image which traditionally represents revolutions and the casting down of rulers. At a time when any disrespect towards the king or the church was severely punishable, propagating this collection of unruly images seemed like asking for trouble. This is based on nothing at all other than presumably his own assumptions about how in the past people were more conservative. That's not necessarily a thing in that way. The sorts of strange figures that he mentions are things that we have been seeing by this point, in medieval art for centuries. Just all you have to do is look at a Romanesque tympanum, by which point all of this iconography was very well established and in fact used by the church as a method of communication for those entering the church. Look at a tympanum. Everyone would have had to walk right underneath those images. Depictions of the fiery mouth of hell devouring the souls of the damned, people spinning into oblivion, having their limbs ripped off, all manner of demonic creatures, angelic beings, people in various states of dress and undress. The entire point of a lot of these images is to kind of practice and rehearse and talk about the social order using imagery. People would have just been familiar with what this kind of stuff was. There was an elitism involved, so things like Renaissance art definitely wouldn't have been viewed by literally everyone. You had to afford that material, and I'll leave some links in the description box of this video so that people can follow up on some of these things themselves and get themselves started. Again, I'm no expert, but I've just never heard any viable source that includes its own citations talk about history in this way. And I find that tarot books are very susceptible to doing this because they assume that because they think intuitively or something that things in the past were in the past, they seem to assume that they know what they're talking about, and they don't. You know, Yoav Ben-Dov was an academic, but he was a physicist, not a historian. There's a huge difference. There's a reason we have differences in expertise. Another thing that he completely misrepresents, he says, another point to remember is the fact that the images on the cards have no significance in gaming. The usual rules of card games refer only to the rank and value of each card, rather than the details of its illustration. I don't know what he means by usual rules or what he's talking about there, if he's talking about contemporary games to the time period or just games in general. The same cards would therefore be played in exactly the same way, even if their images had been replaced, for example, by a simpler design consisting only of numbers and titles with some innocent decorations. I don't know what innocent means either in this scenario. Yet for nearly 4 centuries, tarot makers preserved the original set of images. I don't know what he means by original. Even the Tarocchi decks commissioned by the same couple vary immensely, but you're also going to get huge differences between the card makers or the decks commissioned in Milan versus other parts of Italy within the same time period. You have competing noble families vying for the top spot in terms of whose imagery is more influential and so on. And again, I'll endeavor to link some starting points below. I don't want to just be saying things out of nothingness. He does say here they did express their creativity by modifying certain details, but the general structure and the card themes have remained almost intact, which would suggest that it was part of how people spoke, common parlance as it were, not just strange radical images that were freaky deaky and nobody understood. He then says, Why did they do it? Why did the tarot card makers insist on preserving a set of images loaded with such heavy and dangerous symbolism? Possibly because it wasn't. If it was irrelevant to the gaming needs of their clients. Again, a very strange way to phrase that. I don't know what he means by gaming needs and clients. Who is he talking about exactly? And how did it all happen that a modest deck of playing cards picked up a set of symbols rich and potent enough to inspire centuries of varied interpretations, speculations, and activities, as the later history of tarot shows? So you see, he's imposing, through his assumptions, a dichotomy between pre-tarot imagery and post-tarot imagery. Pre-playing card simplicity, pre-introduction of the playing cards to Europe, simplicity and innocence, versus all of a sudden this like really occult-laden dark symbolism and so on. It simply isn't how artistic movements work. You have new elements introduced, such as playing card systems, but everybody's always experimenting and innovating and talking to each other and feeling inspired. These things, none of these things, no art is created in a vacuum. They come out of pre-established cultures and understandings and color theory associations and a language around texture and line and technique and who produces what and where they're traveling and who they spoke to and so on. Okay, so after discussing certain possible historical or pseudo-historical theories, which he mostly dismisses, he then says, and what if there was no such secret tradition? If we accept this possibility, then it must have been something in the images themselves that influenced people's minds for centuries, motivating them to preserve this ancient set of symbols. Again, we don't know what he means by ancient set of symbols. That means nothing in terms of historical specificity, what he's talking about, what geographical region he's talking about, and so on. Whose ancient set of symbols? How ancient is ancient? What are we talking about? Thinking further along these lines, we may note that many authors propagating the secret society theory give the impression of a highly disciplined group of initiated sages with a strong spiritual motivation. However, it is more reasonable to think that as a game of chance, the cards actually existed in borderline social areas, such as in clubs of gambling and drinking and cheap pleasures. Tarot making itself seems to have been a shady occupation. In fact, many historical accounts are concerned with pirated, forged, and contraband card decks. Thus, it may be more reasonable to think of the tarot cards as a collective artwork evolving in marginal and half-legitimate popular circles, rather than as sublime teaching kept in secret temples of wisdom and spirituality. Again, a lot of those records around contraband tarot decks is because it was banned by the church for specific reasons of gambling being disapproved on or card playing being perceived as a frivolous personal time, like occupation of your personal time. But that also applied to the upper classes, and the upper classes simply had the money to like be above law and punishment, as it were. So if you're going to have all these records saying they were contraband, that doesn't mean that tarot was born under illicit circumstances. It means tarot existed and the church needed to rein it in a bit. It's a completely different perspective on the same exact pieces of evidence, and citations would explain his line of reasoning. What then was the role of these complex symbols imbued with such strong spiritual and emotional meanings in the questionable gambling venues? One possibility is to look for a psychological answer. Maybe the card images were somehow reflecting the subconscious conflicts and dilemmas of the card players. Maybe in the very places where state authority, the emperor, and the church, the pope, lost their convincing power, people needed some reminder of the complex interplay between light and darkness in human life. We should remember, of course, that people at the time were very religious, so the thought of doing something forbidden must have evoked their deepest conflicts and fears. Maybe contemplating the complex symbols somehow helped them maintain a moral balance while also flirting with the dark and tempting world of sin. Such an idea might explain why they did not want the illustration to be replaced by less charged images. So you see, all of this is completely, first of all, based on the notion that these are charged images that make people feel forbidden things. But second of all, that they're uncharacteristic, they're uncommon, that they are underground. Like, all of that is absolute garbage. All of these images would have been easily viewable along the walls of every single church, and were in wide usage by the church. Artwork commissioned by the church. He has absolutely no ability to place himself within the historical context rather than his own modern assumptions. And the added thing here is to presume a psychological interpretation on people of the past is effectively to erase the way culture works. I'll mention it in a little bit, but there's, for example, even with some of the imagery that's from around this time period, there's a discussion of how a person in history would have understood themselves in relation to a painting they're looking at. But I'll get to that in a bit. There's a portion here where I've written "for fuck's sake" in the margin next to what Yoav has said, so I'll read that bit and then I'll call it quits. Yet something in the elusive and mysterious character of the tarot may inspire us to go beyond purely psychological explanations. We can at least play with the idea that there is something more to it. Maybe the magic of the cards represents some real magic in the world. Maybe there's a meaningful pattern originating in another level of reality, which the tarot cards channel and express at the human level. Okay. Obviously, that is how art works if one has a mystical or spiritual understanding of the world. But it's not just the tarot that does this, and it's not that the tarot suddenly sprung out of nowhere and was able to do this. Tarot had its significance because it spoke a language that people were already speaking. If we have suddenly books written in the vernacular for the first time at a certain point in the Middle Ages, we don't assume all of a sudden that vernacular Italian sprung into being. It was something people were speaking already, and we're moving into a medium slowly, in stages, of writing partially in Latin, partly in Italian, or various forms of medieval German, or whatever other language. We don't just randomly have vernacular languages springing up because all of a sudden there are books written in those languages. That's not how that works. That's not how historical evidence works. And the thing is, even if Yoav Ben-Dov's assumptions here were correct, it would still be his responsibility to provide citations so that anyone with the curiosity to follow through and double check on what he's saying, or simply to learn more about it, would be able to do so. But as he's phrased it here, to take his assumptions and then try to Google that material is actually obscurative. It's going to be difficult to find things if you Google things from the perspective and angle and word choice that he uses. Okay, moving on. From Taschen's Codices Illustres, the world's most famous illuminated manuscripts, 400 to 1600, written by Ingo F. Walter. We have here a discussion in the introduction on books for specialists, but also for everybody. And it says, and this is after a lengthy discussion of religious manuscripts, different types of religious manuscripts, when and how they would have been used, the differentiation between clerical use and personal private use, and so on. But it says, alongside religious manuscripts, of which only the most important are discussed above, and to which we might add homileries, collections of sermons, martyrologies, reports of martyrs, collections of legends, etc., there existed many other types of book, whose contents were predominantly, or indeed exclusively, secular. Of these two, we can only mention a few. Amongst the wide-ranging manuscripts drawing on the findings of antiquity, for example, are the astronomical works of Charlemagne's time, which were clearly based on classical works of mythology and science. They show the constellations and incorporate them into the outlines of human figures, beasts, and legendary beings. Medical knowledge was enthusiastically assembled in books right through the Middle Ages, and informative illustrations were placed with it on the page. Other codices were filled with experiences of the art of warfare and illustrations of weapons with animal and hunting pictures, which were partly based on empirical observation. There are also isolated examples of textbooks on architecture. The manuscripts of a profane character, which mainly portray medicinal plants and describe their particular features, also look back to antique tradition. Such herbals, as they are called, are represented here by the Taciunum Sanitatis. A type of manuscript which is zoological in character, on the other hand, is found in the bestiary. The entire knowledge of an age was collected together in the encyclopedia. The most significant of all encyclopedic works of the 12th century was the richly illustrated Hortus Deliciarum of Herod of Landsberg. However, in 1870, the original was unfortunately destroyed by a fire in Strasbourg. And in terms of narrative literature, history, and travel writing, we have: the art of chivalry is manifest in a singular way in profane manuscripts, works of learning and poetry, though it is true that these are less often accompanied by explanatory or decorative pictures. The Rolandslied, Song of Roland, by Conrad the Priest, had already appeared around 1170. the first German work to draw on this material. Mention should be made above all, however, of the Aeneid in Berlin, or the Aeneid. Heinrich von Beldecke's Middle High German epic about the fall of Troy and the fate of Aeneas is here played out in well over 100 miniatures. Together, these make up the earliest, still fairly restrained illustration of the great courtly epics, which would later come to become the subject above all of French manuscript illumination. Although it would only be after some considerable delay, King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table would come back into life in French miniatures, as would Lancelot, Percival, Tristan, and Alexander the Great. And as already mentioned, Dante's famous Divine Comedy would provide a source of inspiration to miniaturists for several centuries. The Romance form was associated with didactically allegorical material, as in the French Romance of the Rose and other Minnesang allegories. This interest in worldly subject matter gained ground and led to the famous Codex Manus, a Middle High German lyrical anthology which portrays chivalric life and everyday events in unprecedented wealth of detail. There is nothing in a French book illumination to compare with it. The numerous illuminated copies of the World Chronicle by Rudolf von Elms belong here too. This is one of the most popular books of all in the Middle Ages, and the loveliest example is now in St. Gall. The portrayals of fantasy settings and descriptions of travels, such as Marco Polo's Book of Wonders, are often close to the chivalric romance. In the field of profane literature, the number of different types of illuminated manuscript can be expanded almost without limit. We could include law documents, medical treatises, and textbooks, specialist literature such as Frederick II's Guide to Falconry, De Arte Vivandi cum Avibus. Then there are learned editions of diverse authors of classical antiquity, which were popular above all in the Renaissance. The range of manuscripts in the autumn of the Middle Ages was rich, varied, and international, and served a market that embraced customers from all classes of society. So in Fadon's book, The Northern Renaissance by Geoffrey Chips Smith, in the chapter called The Inner Gaze, Private Devotional Art, we are discussing, again, the Northern Renaissance artists and some of the innovations they are making in their art, building off of what they were taught in terms of technique and what the established way of doing things was, which is always evolving. So it says here, artists developed new compositional formulas that allowed their patrons to be shown in veneration of and close proximity to Christ, Mary, or other holy figures. This was especially common in altarpieces and memorials, in which the donor was presented as witness to or a participant in a religious scene. Small diptychs and triptychs grew in popularity. Recall that Van Eyck's diminutive Madonna in a church probably had an accompanying portrait pendant. Roger van der Weyden devised half-length devotional diptychs for several Burgundian courtiers, in which Mary on the right side holds her son. And here's the key point. Although today we think in terms of the viewer's perspective, in Renaissance pictorial theory, orientation was reckoned looking out from within the painting. In portraiture and in devotional art, the right side, or the viewer's left, was the more privileged because the good thief who accepted Christ's divinity before his death was crucified to Christ's right. Other cultural factors, as implicit in the words dexterous, right, and sinister, left, affected the orientation. And the discussion goes on from there. I will show aspects of the images on the opposite page on the screen. And these images were done in approximately, it says circa, the 1460s, so 1460 itself, somewhere around there. Contemporaneous with the birth, time, place, and so on, roughly speaking, within a decade or so of Tarocchi decks and so on. Again, commissioned by courtiers. We have, if we have the images of tarot, we have the images of the church along the walls, Michelangelo's ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but also the Last Judgment behind the altar at the very, very top of the church, at the end of the nave. If we have Romanesque tympanums, we have personal religious devotional art, as this chapter discusses. If we build on the notion that the, loosely speaking, late medieval and Renaissance understanding was that when you're looking at an image, you're meant to be placing yourself in there, like pathworking almost. You are the person in there. If you are looking at an image, of Death dancing with the maiden. That's meant to be about you. If you are looking at the image of a tortured soul stripped naked in hell, as represented in the Devil card, for example, that's meant to be a narrative about you. You are in hell, potentially. Better really invest yourself in the concepts being discussed within these visual systems. So, as Yoav was indicating, for it to be purely a psychological thing, a manner in which they can just grapple and reestablish things and distance themselves from this and blah, 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 from a very modern way of discussing those things, presumes that one is looking at these images and as a separate entity, and the image itself as a separate entity. These places have languages they speak, body language, cultural references, and commonalities that are what culture is made of. And art plays a huge role in that throughout the entirety of human history. The simple woodcut exemplifies the revolutionary character of the print, a new medium pioneered by Northern Renaissance artists. Artists in southern Germany and along the Rhine were responsible for most of printmaking's early technical inventions and distribution practices. They quickly recognized that prints were reproducible, portable, affordable, and iconographically flexible. As paper became readily available, a woodcut, replicated 1,000 more times, could be acquired by people who had never owned a work of art. Furthermore, a print's lightweight facilitated its distribution locally, regionally, and even internationally. Printmakers enjoyed a flexibility not shared by most other artists. Painters, sculptors, glaziers, weavers, and metalworkers invested more time and expense in a single work than did printmakers. Most prints, unless illustrating a book, were made for the open market rather than on commission. While today we think of a woodcut or engraving as a collectible item, a Renaissance purchaser used prints in many ways. They functioned as devotional or intellectual aids, talismans, decorations for furniture or walls, playing cards, announcements of local events, explanations of portents, such as a two-headed calf or a bright comet, satirical or polemical commentaries, and of course, works of art. There was a tremendous demand for devotional prints like St. Dorothy. In a published sermon of the late 15th century, a famous preacher of Strasbourg Cathedral, Johann Gehler von Kaisersberg, urged his audience, "If you cannot read, then take one of those paper images on which the meeting of Mary and Elizabeth is painted. You can buy one for a penny. Look at it and think how happy they were and full of hope, and come to know that in your faith. Then show your extreme reverence for them. Kiss the picture on the piece of paper. Bow down before it. Kneel in front of it. Call upon the Virgin. Give alms to a poor person for her sake." He stressed prints' cheapness and practical function. It was not just the illiterate who purchased them. The woodcut would be held and kissed in reverence, damaging actions that explained why so few early woodcuts survive. Most were thrown away and replaced. Albrecht Dürer learned how to design woodcuts in the later years of the 1400s or 15th century. He also recognized the economic and artistic potential of this medium. Upon returning from his 1495 trip to Italy, Dürer produced large woodcuts of unprecedented complexity, culminating in his Samson and the Lion and his Apocalypse series. Samson, depicted as superhuman, fights a lion. The beast's death is imminent as the Old Testament hero plants his right leg on the lion's neck and prepares to rip his jaws apart. The animal's natural ferocity is surpassed by Samson's own wild expression and the agitation of his hair and clothing. I think we can see here a resemblance to the Strength card. And it remains to be seen whether Pamela Coleman Smith's interpretation or any other historical interpretations of this image are purposefully inverting the male or masculine to the feminine, and whether the wildness is versus domestication and the active versus passive is a later innovation, or whether it was contemporaneous with this sort of interpretation. I think you'll also notice in the background we have a very tarot-like imagery. It's really common in late medieval, early Renaissance, and high Renaissance art to have ships shown on the water in the back, or rivers with waterways going back where people are purposefully looking into the water to indicate this is an area in which trade is paramount. It's a format for displaying wealth, but also for locating the sacred in the everyday and causing that to appear corporeal, mundane, but also sort of where the richness and wealth of life is held. The early history of engraving followed a different course than the woodcut. The first engravers were gold and metalsmiths. Goldsmiths occasionally inked and printed a flat relief to test its proper cutting. It was then just a short step to reproducing and selling their impressions. The earliest engravers were active along the Rhine, and the technology soon spread rapidly, especially across Germany and the Low Countries. The master of the playing cards is perhaps the first artist with a recognizable body of engravings. He is named after a set of 60 engraved playing cards divided into 5 suits: flowers, wild men, birds, deer, and lions and bears, each consisting of 8 numbered cards and 4 face cards. Card games were introduced into Europe in the 14th century from Islamic lands and rapidly became popular. The number of cards and the standardization of suits varied. The French system of suiting, spades, hearts, clubs, and diamonds, started around 1480, eventually prevailed. The delicacy of the lines of the Queen of Wild Men, shown here on the screen, suggests that the artists only lightly scratched the surface of the plate with a stylus rather than a burin, and that each card was printed by hand rather than with a press. The engraving has the look of a silver point drawing, as thin, straight, parallel lines define lightly shaded areas. The use of lines to convey tonal variations and spatial depth anticipate engraving's greater pictorial potential than the woodcut. Numerous copies after his engravings demonstrate the popularity and regional distribution of his prints. As this book goes on to discuss some of the advancements in the subtlety and line quality of engravings more specifically now, it also indicates through the images it shows just how much this propensity and this tradition of showing the breadth of human society, of figures, moral or immoral, high or low, and so on, sort of crammed into these effectively cosmological images, continues. And one of the images here in the book that really fascinates me is this letter N from the fantastic alphabet, from the 1460s, 1465. And you can see in the letter itself that each and every point and shape is made up by a human or humanoid figure, and that we have social commentary occurring here. A person inverted or a person pictured from behind, the sort of grotesque faces of some of the individuals, laughter, curiosity, inquisitiveness, and also a tiered structure, so you might even be able to infer hierarchical stuff. I've not yet looked into this image myself, but I'm really quite curious about it. It also mimics, I think, in my mind anyway, it reminds me of a lot of the sort of children's book illustrations that I would have been exposed to when young, as well as some of my current favorite artists, such as Rima Staines of Hedgespoken Press, who functions out of a very highly sort of late medieval visual style. Another thing I want to mention is that Dürer in particular was known for being very enterprising in the way in which he approached getting his prints out to the public. As the book here kind of indicates, and in other books I've come across as well, obviously these Northern Renaissance artists, especially once sort of like the painterly types found their way into the sort of woodcut and engraving printmaking world, saw the market open and that opportunity for a bit more of self-sufficiency independent of commissions. But Dürer in particular is known for commissioning people to bring his prints to other countries internationally, other regions within the North, to sell his works for him. And when he traveled, he also supported himself by those means in many ways. And he really was also quite protective of his work. So there's a potentially apocryphal mention of a story in here in which he effectively appeals to the authority of a local area because he finds someone who's been making copies of his work, and it's effectively an intellectual property case, and it's something I want to look into a bit further in the future. And really kind of the sort of thing I want to get at as I'm sort of exploring this. This is an Art Witch Chronicles video, so it's not necessarily going to arrive at anything conclusive. I'm just showing, I'm sort of indicating process and how I start cobbling ideas together and sort of documenting it for myself for further reference. But as I go through this, something I want to highlight is that in particular with books like Yoav Ben-Dov's open reading technique, The technique of open reading is how you read historical paintings. And it's something that I may be able to cover more in depth in like a more dedicated video. But the point I want to make right now is that as we've seen with the Samson and the lion image, as can be found in other prints, early prints, medieval images, certain mythological themes, cosmological understandings of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and so on. I think it's really interesting to take a look at the images we have and realize that there was an entire world and language, visual language, built up around these things already, and that the techniques for printing and mass production came along and were able to skyrocket that into the worlds and hands of more people. Which is effectively what tarot still is, or I think should be, but really is. The ways in which we approach the visual language of tarot, I think anyway, cannot be distinguished from the systems of tarot itself. I think the thing, again, with this process video that I would like people to take away from this is that it's your curiosity and inquisitiveness that is going to give you more depth. You know, I am by no means an expert. This is literally a video showing me just gathering notes and practicing ideas and reminding myself of random things and cobbling them together in something totally new and synthetic. But that's the point. That's what tarot does. That's what tarot always has done. That's what Tarocchi was doing. That's what gambling cards were doing. That's what the 3-card court system of the early playing decks introduced to Europe were doing. That's the commonality. That's the point. That's why we're here. So, yeah.